дослідження?
Цього разу в цілому. Весь аналітичний центр, але основний доповідач пан Олексій.
Аналітичний центр назва?
Хіба немає в нас цього?
Нема.
Це, мабуть, КНВ.
Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform starts its operation. My name is Vasil Samakhvalov, and now we will be talking on an important topic, important for Ukraine, the cooperation with the countries of Global South. So today we have a study that we are about to discuss. It was prepared by the Analytical Center Ukraine United, and after the presentation we will be able to discuss the studies. So joining us are Oleksiy Kush, economist, financial analyst, Petro Oleschuk, political expert, PhD in political science, and Dmytro Levus, international expert. So, Mr. Oleksiy, please let's start with you. So what is the study about? So thank you for the presentation, thank you for the invitation. So Analytical Center Ukraine, or Free Ukraine, Вільна Україна, presents the study on cooperation between Ukraine and countries of the Global South. So my colleagues are going to discuss such things as expert surveys. So within the framework of this study, we've made a roundtable that was attended by the representatives of the countries of the Global South. The ambassadors of Malaysia, Brazil, South Africa were attending. Indonesia as well. Yes, we've invited experts that specialize in Global South. They were joining us online and offline at the roundtables. We've heard a lot of interesting ideas, opinions, and the cooperation between Ukraine and the countries of Global South were regarded in a broad spectrum, such as relations with China and other problems arising in relations between China and Taiwan, and in context of the global tension that we're observing all around the world and around Ukraine, and the role of Ukraine in those global processes that are going on. On top of that, we've studied countries of the Pacific region. On one hand, they are small countries, but on the other hand, they make a significant part of the Global South. And during voting in international organizations such as United Nations, their vote is quite intense in favor of Ukraine. Also, we've studied the matters of Global South in context of African countries, the countries of Latin America, and other Asian countries, not only China, but also such countries as South Korea. However, it's not usually regarded as a Global South country, but geographically, they play quite an intense role in all those processes going on in Global South. So Indonesia, Malaysia, all those countries in the south that are dynamically developing and whose share in the global economy and global processes is growing. So generally, I have to say that within the last couple of decades, Ukraine lost its influence of the countries of the global south. This sector was not regarded as a strategic area of work of our diplomacy. Only within the last couple of years, Ukraine continues to intensify its efforts in development of relations with the countries of global south, understanding their influence in global politics, and this is where Ukraine only formulates its strategy towards the countries of global south and relations with them. So if we regard the structure of the global south is described in the study that we're presenting today, there is no such a crystallization based on the value system or some system of standards, just like in European Union, for example, where fundamental values, fundamental rules are on top of everything. And in global south it's very remotely, sometimes controversial, so Ukraine tries to find keys in all areas, in all those big clusters or segments of global south, and we have to work separately with every such segment or cluster and to find the key to this cluster separately. Well, besides, there are processes of integration which are intensifying between the countries of the global south. They are not always favorable for us. For example, Russia plays certain role in such block of countries as BRICS. We have to study all those processes and respond adequately. So we would like to highlight a number of aspects in relations between Ukraine and global south. First of all, it's the economic relations, increase of trade operations, because Ukraine is exporting goods that are in demand in the countries of global south. First of all, those are the products of our agricultural sector, and in this regard, now that we're witnessing some difficulties with export of Ukrainian agricultural sector products to global markets, the markets of the global south may play a role of alternative, and Ukraine should intensify its trade operations with them. Again, mutual protection of investments and exchange of non-critical technologies, it should all be a part of our package of interaction in the economic sector with the countries of global south. Another area is the humanitarian sector, and here we have to emphasize Ukrainian program Grain from Ukraine that was quite intense in the global platforms. It has become a humanitarian bridge between Ukraine and African countries of global south, because those are the countries where the Ukrainian grain was supplied to, and the major part of this grain, of Ukrainian grain, was supplied to poor African countries that are suffering from famine, deficit of food, and it has become quite a significant humanitarian factor to increase the Ukrainian influence over the countries of the global south. Ukraine started being recognized in the African countries, and we have to understand that not all of the countries are well aware of Ukraine as of country, of our culture, our problems, and such humanitarian bridges, they assist in setting such good relations between different peoples and with many countries of the world. And basically intensification of strikes of Russia on the ports of Black Sea, ports of the Danube, there is an attempt to suspend this program Grain from Ukraine, because Russia is realizing they're losing their influence over the countries of global south through such humanitarian efforts of Ukraine. Yet another sector of cooperation is security, exchange of security information, technologies, and cooperation in the military level. again, we may set up such cooperation and experience of Ukraine as a long-term participant of the security programs of the United Nations organization. Ukraine was taking part multiple times in peacekeeping operations in African continent, and such an experience will come in handy too. Another area is the diplomatic sector. Unfortunately, the diplomatic presence in the countries of the Ukrainian diplomatic presence in the countries of Global South is not so expensive. In some countries there are no even embassies. Where there are embassies, the work is not yet so intense, but we have to catch up with this because we have to intensify and reinforce the Ukrainian security through diplomatic efforts. And yet another area is ideological and information cooperation, I would call it. So Ukraine has to formulate its information messages, its senses, narratives, and deliver them and to communicate them to the countries of Global South, because now Russia is actively doing that through their propaganda, and Ukraine has to repel those information attacks, to resort to information resistance, but in a proactive way. So in this sense, given the diversity of the countries of Global South, their motley nature, we have to find specific information keys to every and each of those countries. Not even to every specific countries, but let's divide them into clusters. For example, the countries of Africa, they have concerns with regard to colonial policy. The term neo-colonialism is being widely used in the works of African philosophers and publicists, and Ukraine has to demonstrate that the Russian attitude towards Ukraine is the expression of neo-colonialism, basically the exercising of practices of 19th century, not even century 20. And all those messages with regard to anti-colonial fight of Ukraine against Russian colonialism, all those seeds, they may fall into a fertile soil. So we have to explain the neo-imperial policies of Russia, because all those African countries, they were fighting for their freedom against such large global empires that were controlling those territories, and they take any expressions of neo-imperial policy very sensitively. So this is where we need to communicate our senses that the modern Russia is the new era empire, and their policy is no different from the policy of, say, Spanish Empire in the countries of Latin America a couple of centuries ago. And talking about Asian countries, we have to put the emphasis on the fact that during the war of Russia against Ukraine, Russia resorts to genocide tactics. For example, China, that was suffering from Japanese aggression during World War II, they are quite sensitive to the expressions of genocide practices. So this is where we need to make where we need to make emphasis on to communicate our messages, not just to urge them to support us, not to call them to support us, but to demonstrate why the countries of the Global South are supposed to support Ukraine. And on top of that, we have to understand that all those accents, economical trade accents, they are moving towards the countries of the Global South, which play increasingly bigger role in global geopolitical processes. And in this sense, Ukraine could be an initiator of a number of initiatives. For example, in Ukraine, we discuss the matter of reforms of a United Nations Security Council. For example, Ukraine could initiate the inclusion of India as a permanent member of Security Council, as a representative of the countries of Global South. So this initiative by Ukraine could become a bridge between Kiev and Delhi in terms of strengthening the ties and supported by India of our formula of peace that Ukraine is actively presenting in global platforms. So Ukraine could create a permanently standing summit or conference of countries in a format like Ukraine and countries of the global south to discuss common problems arising all across the globe, including the ones related to geopolitical transformation. Also, we could initiate creation of the joint platforms at the level of European Union and Ukraine and certain clusters of the countries of global south, such as Latin America cluster, African cluster, Asian cluster. And this format could become such a countermeasure against geopolitical blocs such as BRICS, for example. So we can demonstrate to the countries of global south that cooperation with the countries of European Union may open bigger doors for them, so to say, and Ukraine can serve as a bridge country, a country that connects these two worlds, the Western world and the world of the global south. Ukraine has certain advantages in this sense because politically and economically and ideologically we gravitate to the European Union, to the West, because it's even in our constitution. However, our anti-colonial fight, anti-imperialistic fight also creates certain features that are in common with the countries of the global south. This is why we may generate senses that are clear for both Europe and the countries of the global south, and we may become this bridge or link between the countries of the global south and the countries of the Western world. Thank you. Well, what's the best wish? Like, I'm curious about quite practical things. You were saying about the survey, so where can it be found? How can we download it and read it? Where can it be downloaded? Well, the microphone, please, because no one can hear you without the microphone. Thank you. So you can get familiarized with the study, well, like this. This is what it looks like, and you may visit the website of Ukraine United Analytical Center, where this survey can be downloaded. You can check through it, look through it. Maybe you may find something else of interest to you on that website, because that's not the first study that we're presenting, and really, to a certain extent, first of all, it's related to the suggestions and ideas expressed by Oleksiy, but in the same way we were trying with all of our analytic centers to make our input. For example, we've decided to make a survey of experts to expand our view of the problem, and in order not to limit our opinions, to try to look at this problem under different angles. So what was the methodology? Expert survey? Yes, expert survey based on 30 questions where experts were able to provide their answers. Well, the format required some time to be spent, so probably not so much participants were involved as we wanted, but that's not only our analytical centers, those are the independent experts, representatives of other analytical institutions. We also address the embassies of the countries that we may refer to as countries of the global south. And after this survey, we've summarized the results that are reflected in this report, in this study. Everybody can read through it. Again, I'm not going to read through it in whole because I think it's not so necessary, but let me stop at a number of items because I was the one behind systematization of the results of the survey, so I was trying to isolate some trends. And basically all the thoughts expressed by Oleksiy, they are shared by the representatives of the survey. However, there are some things that are worth emphasizing. For example, almost all of the participants of the survey, in the context of potential areas of cooperation between Ukraine and countries of the Global South, they were emphasizing the economic cooperation, specifically in the sphere of agriculture. That's the consensus that had everyone's support. But among other areas of economic cooperation, the participants also emphasized such areas as cooperation in the area of IT, another potential sector after the agriculture. Also, everybody keeps emphasizing a high level of interaction, not even interaction, but a high level of influence that Russia still has over the countries of the Global South, and this influence has quite an objective foundation. It would be thoughtless to reject it, but again, the position of many experts was that this influence can be countered on a lot of levels: diplomatic, economical, political. But to do that, we need to expand the diplomatic representation of Ukraine in those countries. And right after the survey, by the way, we find out about opening of a number of embassies in the countries of Africa. So that was the trend that was sensed not only by the participants of the survey, but that was probably the mainstream thought in Ukrainian policy or politics. I'm sorry. Yet another nuance I think needs emphasizing, Oleksiy was mentioning it, is the attitude and certain stereotypes in assessment of Ukraine as a country and the war between the war against Russia. I mean, the evaluation by those countries or assessment by those countries, as experts were emphasizing, we need to change the perception, because currently the perception of this war is influenced by perception of Ukraine as something that has relation only to the West, and West in the countries of Global South is perceived as somebody with ambiguous reputation or even an opponent. So in the context of positioning of Ukraine, we have to pay attention to such nuances as the fact that, in fact, Ukraine is expressing anti-colonial efforts, and in this context, this is what we should emphasize, that Russia is trying to reinvent the neo-colonial practices that are a present challenge for a lot of countries of the Global South, which may face those practices in one form or another. Also, we need to focus and emphasize the cooperation, because everybody makes an emphasis on cooperation, specifically in the sector of agriculture. So the agricultural security needs to be emphasized as we develop cooperation with those countries in the level of the governments, in the level of institutions and agencies, because this is what unites us, what is in common between Ukraine and countries of the Global South. Free movement of food products, the food security, all of this is intertwined. Also, we need to mention that Ukraine is fighting for its existence, first of all, and this is why we need to pay attention to public diplomacy. And yet another interesting moment, in my opinion, we want to emphasize the necessity of intensification of cooperation between Ukraine and countries of Global South in cultural sector, in format of different exchanges, education exchanges, and reinforcing the existing ties. So this is the short summary of the ideas expressed in this study. And again, let me repeat myself, everybody can get familiarized with its results in this study. Again, it contains something that Oleksiy was mentioning and other things that are related to the summaries of the work of the round table organized by our analytical centers. So before you pass the floor to Dmytro, I think we will finalize this circle of presentation. I would like to double check whether it's correct to call all those countries of Latin America, Africa and Asia as is it correct to call them all global south, because it was mentioned that they are all diverse, they have all different interests. Well, if I'm allowed, let me express my opinion. Oleksiy could mention something too, but first of all, I think we have to emphasize that this is such a conditional term. Well, you know, terms define everything. Well, yeah, right. Again, first of all, it's meant to draw attention to those countries that do not belong to what we are used to call the West. Well, so it's West and the others, right? Well, yeah, but at the same time, defining some phenomena based on some negative terms, it's not quite right. This is why we've picked this term, global south. Yeah, but for the sake of justice, it was not us who has picked that term. Yeah, but it has become quite actual in scientific and political discourse. This is why we resorted to use of the term that is already existing in this discourse. And maybe Oleksiy wants to add something. Well, basically what I would like to add is that we have to understand that consolidation of the global south is extended in time, because if we take, like, say, a couple of hundreds of years ago, Europe was as diverse and motley. There was a lot of different countries with different interests, but within centuries or after the centuries, Europe got united about the joint platform of values. And in the same way, the countries of Global South, we see that currently the processes of self-organization are going on there. Why there's a lot of mentions of BRICS now? Because previously it was just an acronym, a club of countries that were gathering elsewhere and didn't play any significant role. What we're seeing now, they have significant ambitions. There's inclusion of new members. They developed their joint currencies or something like that. So it's difficult to forecast how long their consolidation will go. But again, the Global South has undergone its geopolitical transformation, and all those processes are related to increase of the weight of the Global South in geopolitical processes. Yeah, let's proceed to the following speaker. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I would like even to quote, we first of all would like to thank everybody who was a part of this study, who was a part of a roundtable that, by the way, was going on in the Ukrinform platform. That was a wonderful event. And for example, talking about stereotypes, again, we've touched upon this issue, right? How to identify what Global South is quite logical. And for example, what we were talking about, that first of all, there is a stereotypical dichotomy that there is rich north and poor south. Even given the conditions of this Global South, it's not quite true, because yeah, we have quite a good illustration here. What and how can we refer to as a Global South? And even there we know that, for example, there is Argentina, who takes all possible efforts to prove that they are no Global South. And even Brazil, even being one of the BRICS locomotives, I think that there might be some questions arising. Again, there is another stereotype or stereotypical statement that the countries of the global south are not always anti-West, and that's true to a certain extent. That there is really such trend, but even the latest votings in the United Nations, we see that it's not quite so active Ukrainian diplomacy. Let's recall that there were 2 tours of the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Africa. The first tour was interrupted after the beginning of the massive Russian strike on Ukraine, and then there was a second tour, and this voting in the United Nations, yes, or those votings in UN, they do not demonstrate any mental changes that should have happened in the global south. We cannot say they're irreversible, but again, support of Ukraine and non-support of Russia is evidence of something already. And again, we may say that, for example, that the role of Chinese People's Republic, we were discussing it, and right away as we hear Global South, PRC, BRICS, institutionalization of Global South, that was just mentioned by Oleksiy, the whole pile of illusions, reminiscences, but we can confidently state, for example, that PRC tries to be a voice of the global south without referring themselves to as a global south, because they view themselves as the center of power, and it was always like that, let's be honest. And again, not all of the global south wants China to be their voice. This is obvious. And this is what we see in the results of our survey. That's another sector we have to work on, even in view of the current agenda, in the context of preparation to the Global Peace Summit, where the representatives of the Global South countries will be present too, 70 or 80 of them, and promotion of the peace formula suggested by President Zelensky is going on under conditions of Global South. And as we talk about this influence of PRC, that is expressed as pressure, as a demand to have the aggressor country, Russian Federation, to take part in that summit too, whose president is quite whose presidency is not quite legitimate after the latest Russian elections, and the Parliamentary Assembly has expressed those concerns too. So in this context, we have to remember about this necessity to continue our work with the Global South and suggesting some separate agenda for the countries of Global South, because not everybody likes to be imposed a Chinese hegemony or institutionalization through BRICS, where the hegemony of other countries in the header is quite apparent. And all those platforms being created as a result of this dialogue over Russian aggression against Ukraine. So that's apart from our diplomatic efforts in Africa and Latin America, I mean opening of the embassies. So this is exactly the moment during which we can create, if not the new agenda for the countries of the global south, at least we may transform the existing dialogue and to establish new communication ties with the world, with the north. Thank you. Thank you. So before proceeding to the questions from the floor, let me ask the first question. We were talking a lot about the study, but let's imagine you have 2 minutes to tell a person on whom the decision making depends, like he says, like, give me 3 or 5 suggestions from your survey, what should I focus on? So like these 2 minutes, what would you suggest to work with the countries of the global south? You know, when president was asked, like, if my address has to last 5 hours, I can do it now. If I have to fit it within 5 minutes, yeah, I need 3 days of preparation. Yeah, so for example, look, you come up with this study and you're being asked, okay, we're going there, I need specific advice. What should we do tomorrow? Right away. So first of all, diplomatic solutions. We need Ukraine to use our chance to become a link between West and the countries of the global south. That's a unique opportunity for Ukraine to take advantage of our geopolitical stance, our international transitivity, a potential of the country that can become a bridge between civilizations. Secondly, it's the fact that our economic interests are to a significant extent in the countries of global south. Our markets are there. We have to develop the cooperation there, and one of the biggest projects could be the free trade zone with India. It could be a whole economical jackpot for Ukraine. And thirdly is the security military cooperation. Ukraine, as a country who knows already how to work with the military technologies, who has some military potential, we can actively help the countries of the global south so they could protect their independence on technological information level. So those 3 sectors could summarize the key Ukrainian position in its cooperation with countries of global south. Diplomacy, economy, military, right? Exactly. Questions from the floor. Nadia Yurshenko, Ukrinform. I have 2 questions. First, you've mentioned that Ukraine has lost its influence in the countries of global south, but can you please remind me, when did we have any influence there and over whom we had it? And secondly, well, MFA has developed 3 strategies: Asian, African and Latin American. How does your study correlate with those strategies? Is it a fresh view or is it developing those strategies? Because in my opinion, it's a little bit outdated. Thank you. Well, talking about the influence of the countries of the global south, Ukraine, as a country that has become independent after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we inherited certain baggage of contacts and relations with the countries of the global south. In fact, in context of this heritage, there were things we had to dump, but there were some useful things that we had to preserve, because Soviet Union was actively cooperating with the countries of global south. It was expressed in ties at the level of not only some military or reconnaissance operations or intelligence operations, but there was political, economic cooperation. A lot of Ukrainian specialists were working in the countries of global south. Many Ukrainian companies were cooperating with the countries of global south. This is why, if we recall the 90s, when Ukraine was entering into one of the biggest countries for supply of the tanks to Pakistan, or when Ukraine was entering into agreements with Brazil to build Antares rocket carriers, or I apologize, not Antares, Cyclone. It was the rocket carrier Cyclone. It was one of the biggest space projects for the countries of Global South. It was a significant event that unfortunately ended unsuccessfully. Well, I may recall other projects that we had in common, like oil mining in Egypt, cooperation with other countries of the Global South. So, saying that we had no contacts, it would be a lot of exaggeration, because Ukraine was present in many countries of the Global South, and participation in such projects as a space project in Brazil and other projects, that was inevitably evidence of the fact that this strategy existed. How successfully, that's a matter of whole different conversation. But lately, within the last 15 years, Ukraine started losing its positions. Why did it happen? That's a topic of yet another conversation. But I think that we have to talk about resumption of our relations with the countries of the Global South, because we're not starting from scratch. Ukraine has a history of relations with the countries of Global South, and if we talk about just personal context between the companies, they are long-term cooperation. Even during this period of independence, there are projects that are still that we still have in common. And talking about the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we were writing this work with regard to these strategies too, but in our case we were trying to build a more expanded pattern, so to say. We didn't only touch upon the political but also economic information strategies that can be promoted in the countries of Global South. This is why I wouldn't say that we issue our strategy as a countermeasure to those strategies of MFA. Well, just let me add, in fact, the Ukrainian civil society, the experts, they are quite active in the area of Global South. Let's not forget about those visits. There was a presentation in Ukrinform. Mr. Oleksiy Kush was making a presentation. They were visiting Latin America and Africa, and yeah, there can be no contrast or opposition to those strategies. We can even say that the topic alone, it should continue existing as an environment where the ideas and opinions are born. In our study, this idea of necessity of not like a second plan diplomacy but expert diplomacy is mentioned too. And in my opinion, it's more of an addition. Well, obviously nobody is aiming at replacing state policy, but unfortunately those strategies, they've emerged a little bit too late. Just like Oleksiy has mentioned, it's the resumption of active policy on the level of Global South. I think it's not quite correct, because it's more like Ukraine had huge potential to exercise this policy in the Global South, like all those facts that Oleksiy has mentioned, including Brazil and Africa. By the way, we may also recall the training, education. So that was all the potential that did not get reformatted as a huge policy in the countries of Global South. It was not completely lost again, but objectively saying, Ukraine was not as active as it could, and Russia has remained in the same positions that were created by the Soviet Union. Basically, they inherited those positions, and now they may parasite on this image of liberator, which was assisting to all those national liberation movements. And just a couple of words regarding the influence and everything related to it. In my opinion, it's necessary to mention that the 90s and the beginning of the 21st century was the period when Ukraine had many opportunities which were not, unfortunately, fully used. For example, part of Ukraine as a participant of peacekeeping operations of United Nations. Ukraine was quite an active participant, and the majority of those peacekeeping missions were in the countries that we refer to as the countries of Global South. It could be quite a good foundation for diplomatic weight of Ukraine, and some of this potential we only start using it now. For example, opening of Ukrainian embassy in Cote d'Ivoire can again be related to this, because Ukraine was gaining more authority by these peacekeeping operations. Another thing is cooperation in the military industrial sector. The African countries were the biggest consumers of Ukrainian manufactured material. We can see the Ukrainian material being commissioned by the armies of many countries of African continent. And again, the majority of foreign students who were studying in Ukraine, they were representatives of the countries of Global South again. And in the same way, Ukraine had some significant representation there, but due to the lack of subjectivity on the level of its own policy, it's not like Ukraine could not use this potential. For a long period, we could not even formalize this potential and channel it properly to not only implement business projects, but also diplomatic projects, but not only formalized state diplomacy, but the soft power diplomacy as well. It could all be an efficient tool of soft power, but in my opinion, this potential was not used, was not quite used in full. Yeah, we need a little bit of translation here. Just a sec.
Okay, please. Мене звати Christopher з Analytical Media. My question is two questions essentially. First, you mentioned the old weapons manufacturing that was gutted, obviously, a decade ago under Yanukovych. How much did that change the relationship with these countries? Like, because you got really close there. How and do you see a chance it brings any of those back? And number two, when it comes to a country like India that now has told Russia, well, we're going to look elsewhere for some of our weapons. They declared neutrality on their vote at the beginning of the war, and the ambassador told me that, well, we could have voted with Russia, but we didn't. And then said, let's be honest, Ukraine gave munitions and weapons to our adversary, Pakistan. And yet, there has been this positive relationship with India. So maybe we can elaborate on how that complexity moves forward. Дякую.
Хто буде відповідати?
So who wants to answer? Who wants to answer about India? So, well, first of all, the supplies of weapons were always viewed as the tool of geopolitical influence in the world. And in this context, Ukraine was one of the not so numerous countries that, for example, during the 90s and the beginning of the 21st century, we've commercialized this issue, so to say, politically commercialized it, because the political elites were using the weapon supplies to get some funds for this. Specifically, it was very characteristic for the 90s, to take part in some gray supply schemes, but those supplies were never used to reinforce the political influence of Ukraine and to convert those supplies into some economic or geopolitical or trade bonuses. In this sense, we may say that the supplies of weapons to the African countries did not result in establishment of some stable influence there or establishing some stable support. So it was some no-name weapon supply, just some political commercialization. Yes, right. And the same can be said about the participants of Ukrainian peacekeeping forces. In this sense, the most demonstrative or the most illustrative was the participation of Ukrainian forces in Iraq Forces Coalition. Ukraine was represented by one brigade, and it was one of 5 countries with the biggest contingent there during this operation in Iraq. And we've seen that almost all of the countries taking part in that coalition, they've reinforced their positions in that country, political, economic, trade positions. So to a certain extent, they were using it as a tool to reinforce their stance there. Ukraine demonstrated a unique, well, with the negative connotation of unique, a unique example when our participation in this military campaign, they did not only cost a lot of money and a number of casualties among the military, a couple of dozens of Ukrainian military perished there. So anyway, Ukraine was not able to convert this participation into some political or economic influence in Iraq. If we view the economic relations with this country, the trade turnover or political relations, in fact, we see that it's a country with whom Ukraine as if never had any relations. So it's an absolute void in the relations between Ukraine and Iraq, even despite the fact that Ukraine was taking part in the peacekeeping operation there. So that's the bad example of us failing to use our chances. And talking about India, I've written a number of analytical articles about relations between Ukraine and India, where I was mentioning that among the countries with whom Ukraine had to enter into agreement about the free trade zone, it's one of the countries of global south. Like India is probably the key country with whom Ukraine could enter into such an agreement, because for Ukraine it could become an economic jackpot, because if we talk about trade operations between Ukraine and India, we had always positive trade balance in amount of $1 or $1.5 billion, because we sell more products to India than we buy from them. Indian market is valuable for us because we may not only sell grain or sunflower seed oil there, but also we may sell some products with high added value like machine construction products, Ukrainian industrial products there, because during the Soviet era India was buying Soviet aircraft that Ukraine could manufacture after the collapse of the Soviet Union, turbines and other equipment that was manufactured by Ukraine. So India could buy all those products from Ukraine, and now India is becoming one of the biggest developer projects of the West. So it's regarded by the Western countries as an alternative to China. India demonstrates quite an intense economic growth dynamics, 6, 7, 8% of GDP every year. They outpace China, and there is an alternative to New Silk Way being developed, the way of spices from India to Europe as an alternative of Silk Way from China to Europe. So India is one of the biggest economic projects of the 21st century, And Ukraine, as a country who has an agreement on free trade with Europe, could become a part of this spices way, use its transit potential, and obviously be implemented after the war. But all those senses can be discussed with India now. So I completely agree with you. I was mentioning it in my articles that supply of the weapons to Pakistan was a huge mistake committed by Ukraine back then. It was an evidence of the fact that back then we were not able to timely identify the geopolitical balance of our interests in Asia. And we were failing to understand quite simple things, that economically India weighs way more than this one-off contract for supply of tanks to Pakistan. Well, Ukraine made some $200 million, but India is way more interesting to us in sense of economic cooperation. So I agree, on our end it was a huge mistake. And the last question, please. Roman Kukharuk, information agency Nation. You were saying that China is post-colonial, but there is a Xinjiang and Tibetan problem. What should Ukraine do about that in our dialogue with China? And a question to all of the panelists. Do you think that the statement of former secretary of NSCD who said that Moscovia are the retarded Asians, and where is this state center in Ukraine that generates the policy? You were all saying, and the summary of your study is saying that we should generate or elaborate some, work out some policy. So what is the center for generation of this policy, and where are the Kolchugas? The last question, if they ever existed. Well, I think that about Kolchugas, that's the responsibility of the military. Well, again, talking about China, that's the matter of geopolitical strategy. Ukraine has to identify its strategy of relations with China. We have to identify it based on our geostrategic interests. So in this context, obviously the questions of Tibet, Uyghurs, yeah, it has to be of concern to Ukrainians, but we clearly understand that the modern world is built in a way where the countries work based on their national interests. This is the way the majority of the countries do, both Asian and European. This is why we have two strategies, basically, or conditionally saying, on the table. First is the strategy of finding dialogue with China. If we want to find some common ground to establish some efficient dialogue, given the fact that China is one of the biggest economic forces in the world, geopolitical forces, and military forces too. In the middle of the 21st century, it may become one of the biggest technological forces. That's the first strategy, the strategy aimed to finding a dialogue. And if we resort to confrontation strategy, we probably need to emphasize more and to focus more on our relations with Taiwan, which is of great irritation to China. And on the global platforms, we may to touch more upon the topics of Tibetan freedom, the problems of Uyghurs, but it all should be a matter of not of chaotic geopolitical efforts. For example, today we're saying like we work with China and then we discuss some Taiwanese geopolitical vector. However, yet afterwards we may repeat again that we need to work with China. We should develop some sustainable and predictable international foreign policy. We need to decide what's more important for us during this historic period, and based on this we have to project our China strategy. We have some historical common ground. For example, if we compare the story of such cities as Mariupol and Nankin, this is where we may find a lot of common features. Nankin during World War II and Nanjing during World War II and Mariupol during this war of Russia against Ukraine, a lot of genocide practices and a lot of casualties among civil population. For example, if our embassy in Beijing makes a photo exhibition drawing those parallels between Mariupol and Nanjing, demonstrating that historical connection, it would impress the Chinese society. It will make a deep impression because in China those post-war trauma is still important big time. So talking about relations with Japan, through this historical prism, you know that China is very concerned about these relations. And what was another question? Where is our decision-making center? It's about time we wrap up. So probably Petro may say something about the Kalchukas. Well, talking about the decision-making center, well, our analytical center has no direct relation with the government policy, but hopefully with other analytical centers we want to work out the approach that contemplates that analytical centers may suggest their ideas which may be taken into account as we develop some specific opinions, ideas. So let's wrap up right here. Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform continues its operation tomorrow. See you shortly.